Welcome to the latest episode of International Law Chats, a podcast from the American branch of the International Law Association. I'm pleased to announce that today's episode is also co-sponsored by the Women in International Law Interest Group at the American Society of International Law. The podcast airs on the first Monday of every month, and we hope you can join us each month for a new episode. I'm Milena Sterio, a professor of international law at Cleveland State University College of Law, and also managing director at the Public International Law and Policy Group.
And I am Chiara Giorgetti. I'm a professor of international law at Richmond Law School and a non-resident faculty at the Vienna Diplomatic Academy.
Today, we're very pleased to be chatting with Professor Penelope Andrews, John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law and Director of the Racial Justice Project at New York Law School, and also the recipient of this year's Prominent Woman in International Law, which is an award given by the Women in International Law Interest Group at the American Society of International Law. The award was delivered to Professor Andrews in person at the American Society of International Law annual meeting at the end of April, and we hope that many of our listeners attended the annual meeting, and in particular, the award ceremony. And again, thank you also to the Women in International Law Interest Group for co-sponsoring this episode. Professor Andrews began her teaching career at Australia's La Trobe University, where she taught for 8 years, before moving to the City University of New York School of Law, where she taught public international law, gender and law, race and law, comparative law, and torts for 15 years. She has held visiting appointments at law schools across the U.S. and internationally, and senior leadership posts, including serving as the first Black dean at the University of Cape Town Faculty of Law from 2016 to 2018, and the first female dean and president of Albany Law School from 2012 to 2015. She has served on law school committees and the boards of public interest and human rights organizations, including the Africa section of Human Rights Watch and the National Center for Law and Economic Justice. From 2019 to 2021, she served a 2-year term as the president of the Law and Society Association. She also recently served as chair of the board of the Institute for African Women in Law, and is a member of the National University of Ireland Galway's External Advisory Group on Gender Equality and the Advisory Committee of the South African Research Chair in Teaching and Learning at the University of Johannesburg. Welcome, Penelope.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm so pleased to be here.
It is a pleasure to have you today. Now, let me begin with the first question. A central theme across your career has been your work on racial and gender justice issues and human rights more broadly speaking. In 2026, what do you think are the biggest challenges that we still face in this field? And do you think that the legal instruments that we presently have, such as treaties, customary law, other international documents, are sufficient to affront such challenges?
I think that, the first question I'd like to sort of think about is the idea about how far we've come with respect to racial and gender justice. I think that if we think about, the instruments that were set up and the way that the international law organizations, specifically the United Nations, approached this, I think we started at a time when the world was at an idealistic moment. Post Second World War, we were all, I think, committed to questions of racial equality, particularly the struggle against racial apartheid in South Africa. That generated a lot of commitment and interest and inspiration for fighting racial equality. Gender equality is a little different, even though we know that, for example, CEDAW and the passage of CEDAW and the push by women's organizations and feminist organizations globally has meant that, the issue of women's rights and equality became more central to international law as opposed to marginal. Now, I'm not sure today we live in a very different world. I think we've kind of passed a moment that idealism. I think we're in a sort of much more in a field of backlash, reticence, and so on with respect to gender equality and racial equality. And I think the two are different. So let me just talk very, very generally more about gender equality. Even though racial equality is a big problem, I think gender equality and gender justice faces problems that are much more structural, much more cultural. And so I think that the instruments that we presently have, I think they need to be sort of revisited. And so I think that I'm not sure if we can think about whether they are sufficient. So, I think it's a sort of glass half empty, glass half full. So with respect to racial justice, I think we've come some way. We've made great strides. And as I mentioned, apartheid and other kinds of countries around the globe, we see a greater emphasis, a greater consciousness about racial justice. With gender justice, we made great strides for many decades, and the Me Too movement was sort of the height of it. But now I think there's been a retraction, there's been some backlash. And I think that we have a much greater struggle. And for me personally, I'm involved in the End Gender Apartheid campaign. And I think there are places, particularly Afghanistan specifically, but there are other places where we can see real problems. I would argue gender apartheid, because that's what I've written about, in a place like Afghanistan. So yes, it's there's a lot more hard work to be done with respect to gender justice. And the legal instruments we have, I think they're sufficient. We need to enforce them. It's not a question of whether they're sufficient, it's whether the enforcement is and the implementation is sufficient.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting. And let me follow up on the previous question by asking you something more specifically about the role of international institutions and international organizations in addressing human rights related challenges. So maybe we could focus on this. You have worked across jurisdiction and within many different organizations. And as you mentioned, we can all agree that international organizations plays a very significant role in both developing as well as contributing to the enforcement of international law norms. But when it comes to the field of human rights law, when do you believe that international organization can be most successful? Do we need more international organizations, or maybe do we need to tweak the mandate of some of the existing ones? And especially in the time like today, what do you think we need to do specifically in international organization?
Yes, thank you. I agree with you that international organizations play a significant role in contributing to the enforcement of international norms. So you've asked me three questions there. The first question is, when it comes to the question of human rights, when do we believe that? When can international organizations be most successful? I would say that international organizations can be most successful when countries are amenable to international law and international organizations. And I think that at the moment, we see it's mostly been the case that we have the rule of power as opposed to the rule of law. I think it's the Prime Minister of Canada, Prime Minister Mark Carney, mentioned this at the WTO earlier this year. But I think when countries are amenable and say, we accept that, whether it's an instrument like the ICJ or the ICC, we will accept, what they found. So it's most successful when countries are amenable and so on, and also where countries have the resources to implement what the international organizations find with respect to reports, et cetera, et cetera. And so the question is do we need more international organizations? The first thing I think is that we really need countries to abide by international law, both symbolically and substantively. And unfortunately, I live in the United States, where we see more and more, and particularly this administration, just being skeptical and contemptuous almost of international law. I don't think we need more international organizations. I think we've got an international infrastructure. I think those organizations maybe need to be restructured somewhat. So I think, for example, the United Nations as the preeminent international organization is facing some structural problems and some substantive problems, and maybe we have time to talk about them more later. So to answer the question, we don't need more. We need them to be more effective. We need them maybe to be streamlined, some of them, and so on. And so that's why we need to answer the third question, tweak the mandates of some of the existing ones. But I think that what's very, very important is, from my perspective, We need a greater focus on regional organizations. So I think that we have the large international organizations, but I think that the regional organizations can really be very effective in the implementation of the work of the international organizations. And as they say, all politics is local. So yes, we don't need more. We need better ones. We need more refined ones, and we need countries to see that that international law is important in governance, in the rule of law.
Thank you so much. Now, let me switch gears a little bit and ask you about your judicial experience. I know that you have served as acting judge in Pretoria, South Africa, and I know that in some of your scholarship, you specifically address the linkages between theory and practice in the field of human rights. Can you tell us a little bit more about your judicial experience and how and whether your theoretical and academic expertise in human rights might have informed your approaches on the bench?
So as you probably know in my writing, I have argued very strongly for the transformation of the judiciary in South Africa, but also globally, and specifically with respect to the appointment of female judges. So in South Africa, I think the reason why I argue that, and I'll go to my own personal experience, is I believe that women judges bring a different perspective, not based on their biology and the fact that they're women, but based on their experience and the particular perspectives that they have. And so, for example, when I was a judge in Pretoria in South Africa, which is a trial court as well as an appeal court, there was a case, for example, that involved the division of property between a man and a woman. And because I have been writing about these questions, I'd like to think myself as a feminist, I could bring that particular perspective based on my own experience, my own theoretical work and so on, to really think about the role, what the woman brought to the situation, to the marriage, even though she may not have been formally employed, and brought the kind of resources that the law might recognize. So I think that's very important. I also think that it's important to have women judges because for many young girls and young women, the idea of a sort of role models, the idea of representation, seeing a woman judge says to young girls and young women, I too can be a judge. So I think that it's bringing a perspective, bringing the experience, and then the question of, the question of representation. So my own experience, it was a wonderful experience. I mean, being a judge, I've been an academic for a long time, but I think being a judge is such a significant position to have. You have such an impact on the lives of people, a real impact that's immediate. I know as a teacher, for example, may have some impact in the future on my students and so on and their professional development. But as a judge, you have to make a decision here and now. And I think if your perspective as a woman, based on your experience and your theory, you are able to bring the two together. And that's why I found it for me, such a significant, and I was very grateful for the experience. And that's why I do believe that we need more women in the judiciary to bring those different perspectives and to represent a different way of being a judge.
Thank you very much, Penelope. This is very interesting. And I would like to follow up immediately on this, actually, because I think it's very interesting, the idea that the immediate impact, the fact that women judges can also show, younger women, the importance and the possible role model, and also the different experience that women judges bring to the cases. And the importance in general to have women in the bench. But at the same time, we see that there is a lack of gender parity on the judicial benches, both at the national level, but also in the international jurisdiction, including very much at the International Court of Justice. And this has been a persistent issue. Can I ask you, would you share some of your thoughts regarding how this issue can be approached in the most constructive way, in light of your own experience on the bench? What needs to be done at the various levels, at the local level, at the national level? You mentioned the regional and the international level. what can we do to create pathways for women to begin occupying a higher number of judicial posts?
Yes, yes. That's such an important question. And I think the first is there are two things that need to happen. The first is that governments and the international organizations need to recognize that this is something that needs to be done. So the first thing is you need to recognize that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. So recognition. The second is that you have to make a commitment. These things don't happen by happenstance. You have to affirmatively do things to create the pipeline and to make it possible. So governments and the international organizations must put in place a pipeline, a genuine one, not just lip service. They've got to, and unfortunately, because women are so underrepresented, you actually have to be quite aggressive if you want to get those numbers. Because remember that judges stay for quite a long period. So the opportunities to appoint women doesn't come up as often as because of tenure of judges and appointments and so on. The third is that we really, really need a cultural shift. I think that we can have the commitment, we can have laws that change things and so on, and we need a cultural shift. And really what we need is we need to have leaders, judges, leaders in the judiciary who make this, and particularly males, because men are the majority. We need to bring male allies on board to say, this is what we are committed to, this is what we're going to do, and set targets and goals. So if you say by the end of, we have a 2-year framework, a 5-year timeline, and so on, these are our goals. Because unfortunately, we need to have real numbers and we need to see real change. So that's the commitment. And then the thing that also has to happen is that women lawyers across the world, within countries and those who want to serve in international organizations must be, they must have the tools and the imagination to know that this is something that they can do. So in other words, women who are practitioners now must be able to think of themselves as future judges, because men have historically not, this has not even been an issue. But I think many women, because of culture and because of other kinds of impediments, might not think of themselves as either being good enough or being smart enough or something like that. So I think you have to have a top-down approach and you have to have a bottom-up approach. And that commitment. So in South Africa, for example, we had the Constitution commits the government to, transforming the judiciary. And we can see, if you look at the numbers, that the transformation of the judiciary with respect to racial quotas have been quite, have been quite complementary. It's been very good. But with respect to women, it's been much slower. And part of it is that you have the problem of commitment, but you also have the problem of women not being encouraged, women not being supported, women not being trained. So you need lots of mentoring, you need lots of training and so on. And that's actually going on quite a lot. The Institute of African Women in Law on the continent of Africa have been doing great stuff. There are all kinds of, the International Federation of Women Judges. These organizations are very important. They should be supported. So yes, I think that's a key issue for governments and international organizations to, take on board.
Now, related to this question, I would like to ask you more specifically about the role of mentoring programs for women and professional networks for women, both formal and informal. As we already announced, you have received the Women in International Law Interest Group Prominent Woman in International Law Award. And as you may know, this group has been running a very successful mentoring program for many years, which many of us have participated in, both as mentees and then later on as mentors. In order to work towards more significant gender parity at various national and international law courts, tribunals, and institutions, do you think that we need to develop better support structures for women through formal and informal networks and mentoring programs?
Oh, yes. No, another excellent question. Absolutely, absolutely. I think those mentoring programs are very important. I think that the support structure is a little complicated because it's different from men. So, for example, For women, those informal networks and those informal support structures have to do with choices made about family, about, women have, different workloads with respect to families and so on, whether it's parents, aging parents, or children and so on. And so those informal mentoring roles are important. But I do think that the courts themselves have to, and, the American Society of International Law as an organization and other organizations need to really ensure that the mentoring programs are sustained, are supported, that there's follow-up and so on. So there's a lot of formal mentoring going on, but I think the informal mentoring is important. And with the formal mentoring, you have to have follow-up. So I think that, yes, I absolutely agree. You need those mentoring networks. But I think we're at the stage now where we also need to say, these are the people, we've mentored. These are the structures we have in place. Let's look at the results. Let's do the evaluation and so on. And I think evaluation and review is very much part of the mentoring programs. And we should attach that very much so, because I'm a teacher, so I mentor all the time. And I can really only, assess the success or otherwise of my mentoring by doing the review and evaluation from time to time to see if it's successful. But it's absolutely necessary today, especially for women, because of the kinds of obstacles that women face, which are both obvious and visible, but also invisible and cultural and personal.
Thank you. Thank you. But for our last question, I would like to maybe go back to the beginning and ask you a little bit more about your career, which has really spanned continents and institutions, both academic and in the judiciary. You've been a successful academic, a leader, then including a dean in South Africa, in Australia, and now in the United States, just to name a few of the places. And you've successfully navigated the various challenges associated with working across such different institutions, but also cultures. Would you share with our listeners some of your strategies and some of the ways which you believe have contributed to your success?
Yes, well, thank you. I think that before I start, I should just say that strategies for success also have to include strategies for failure, because, all of us live a life in which we, have goals and we have a vision. Like I have goals and visions, but I also made mistakes. And so for me, the question I've always sort of thought about is, how have I learned from those mistakes? What have I learned from those mistakes? So let me just start with the successes. I think that we all like to think. I thought that because I was approached to be a leader, that I had the skills and I had the experience and I had the temperament and so on. And I really tried to draw on all the positive skills that I had in terms of my professional skills, but also the personal skills of empathy and understanding and listening. And I try to utilize them. But when you are a leader and when you work with people and when you manage people and when people put their careers and their goals and their expectations onto you, sometimes it feels for me, it felt like I had to be a superwoman. And the reality is you don't have to be a superwoman. You just have to be a human being. And being a human being means that you have to exercise the empathy that you can and the understanding, but also have the courage to say, I don't know, I don't understand, or I have the courage to apologize if you made a misstep and so on. So I think for me, and I'd like to think that because I was involved in the struggle against apartheid, because my own personal history was such that there were certain things I had to do as a young person. I lost my mother when I was 13 years old. She died. She was very young. And, that experience, and I didn't have a father at the time. So that experience kind of, for me, was pivotal in my life and helped me made me resilient in a way that, I found helped me later on in my life, ironically. But, because one of the lessons I've learned is that people are different in very fundamental ways. So because I'm a resilient person, I had to learn that the whole world is not resilient. And so sometimes, you have to one of the lessons I've learned is you have to be able to put yourself very much in in other people's shoes. Um, and I think the second is a certain openness. You have to be transparent and open to people, and you have to be honest about things. And I think that's very, very difficult because we don't, we brought up, women particularly are brought up with particular cultural lessons. And one of the cultural lessons is do not show your feelings, do not be emotional. That for a woman to be described as emotional. It can, for some women, it's the biggest, insult. But I'm not here talking about, being emotional and screaming and, drama. I'm talking about being able to show empathy. Sometimes even crying with somebody who's very sad, those sorts of things. I think that those are some of the things that we, on the one hand, you have the large cultural lessons and so on, and the way that men have always led, and, what we see ourselves as leaders. So, in short, what I want to say is that I was used to a top-down approach to leadership, and I had to learn that that's not necessarily the best. That we have to think about leadership both in terms of leading and making decisions, but also a horizontal listening, bringing other people in, thinking about community decisions and so on, how you balance, having to make the decision at the same time, giving people the voice and the opportunity to participate in the decision. A very important lesson for me has always been humor. I think that it's important that people are able to laugh with each other, not at each other, with each other. And humor has been for me, something that I've tried to, or joy, joy and a kind of love. Now, I don't mean, again, Bell Hooks has said that, love is a very powerful force, and people have written about love. Martin Luther King used to talk about the power of love. We're not allowed, I know in the academic circles, to talk about love is to be seen, or joy is to be seen as a little cuckoo, to be seen as a little out there. But the reality is that there's a way in which there's a constructive love, there's a constructive joy that I think leadership does bring. So for me, drawing on the human, drawing on always, trying to learn more, trying to learn from my mistakes, accepting that failure is part of learning, that making mistakes is part of learning, has been very important for my own development. I also think that for women, the lesson for women who go and want to be leaders, aspire to be leaders and become leaders, you have to believe in yourself. You have to, at the core, and I'm talking about a belief, not an arrogant belief, not being arrogant, but having a sense of yourself and centered, having a sense of your values and who you are, because you are always going to be, it's very, very difficult to be a leader with social media, with all kinds of ways in which people really want to, you're being criticized, rightfully people should be criticized. I think it's emotionally very taxing for leaders. And yeah, I think male leaders have the same problems too, with respect to media, social media, and the criticism out there. But I think women, because we have these lessons, these cultural lessons that are thrown at us, we have to be strong and at the core have a full value and a belief in ourselves that will carry us through, because we're in a very, very challenging space right now. But I do think that the world is open. Let me give you an example. Law school deans. When I became the president and dean at Albany Law School, which is now 15 years ago, there was a handful of female deans and a handful of deans of color. It's amazing the number of female deans now. In fact, there are more female deans than deans of color, and women deans are exploding. And similarly, I see, for example, chief justices. Look at the United States and look elsewhere, the number of women who've become chief justices. So I do think that, there's a trajectory moving forward, and we're learning from other lessons. So I've learned from my own lessons, but I've also learned from the lessons of other women leaders. And that's where your earlier questions about mentoring comes in. With the mentoring is the support, and people tell each other, we share, We share our victories, we share our failures, provide each other with lessons, and there's a solidarity that comes about through the mentoring and so on that I think is important for women leaders. And I've benefited from it very much. And I'm very, very grateful to be part of a community of people who have supported me, including getting this award. I'm, as I said, very grateful. I'm pleased, and I'm humbled by it. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing such wise lessons and words. That's very meaningful. And so to wrap things up, thank you very much, Penny, again for taking the time to join us today. Congratulations again for the much-deserved award, and thank you for sharing your insights in your life and in such important issues. I really enjoyed our conversation, and if our listeners have too, you can join us on the first Monday of every month for more international law chats. Thank you also to our amazing podcast producer, Laurie Farid. See you next time.